Right, good afternoon, everyone. Nice to welcome to this afternoon's WIN meeting. We've all been observing the horrors that's going on in the USA at the moment since Trump became president, and the question that's being bandied around, is it fascist or is it not? So we've got John Clark this afternoon, who's a Canadian Marxist, who's going to lead off for 15 minutes on this subject, and then we'll throw the meeting open to discussion. So do you want to fire away, John?
I certainly will. So thank you very much, comrades. I, um, I, I, I find myself doing this because Roger got hold of me. I'd put up a social media post and I'd agonized a bit over this question of the Trump administration and what it represents. And I suspect that all of us have considerable number of questions, and this is clearly a phenomenon that is posing new issues for us to look at and consider. Um, so, in any event, I have since 2008 2010 crisis. Uh, there has been an intensification of the growth of a new right wing current. It's been an international phenomenon. It's been populist in nature. It's been thoroughly racist, nationalist, and highly authoritarian. And it's taken power in some countries and it vies for power in other countries. Um, I think that it's emerged clearly out of conditions of enormous instability and uncertainty that exist, and it's fed upon a mood of reactionary rage that has consumed a significant percentage of the population in a number of different countries. Um, the the question the question constantly comes up whenever a government takes a reactionary direction of racism, and I do think in some quarters of the left there has been a long-standing tendency to overdiagnose fascism to a very very large degree, um, and I've often been critical of that. With regards to this current development of right wing movements, of which the Trump administration is obviously the pressing question at the moment. With regards to that, I had formed the opinion that what we had was certainly a very authoritarian reactionary movement, but we had one that was operating in such a way as to retain the institutions and forms of bourgeois democracy while restricting them significantly. The Canadian former Conservative Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, had advanced a concept that he called ordered liberty. And his notion was that the democratic freedoms should be allowed, but they must be constrained within certain areas that were acceptable to the establishment. So overt anti-capitalist, anti-colonialist positions, etc., were not considered tolerable, particularly Palestine solidarity. So it seemed to me that we did not have something that was comparable to an attempt to abolish the norms of bourgeois democracy. But in the last period, I think the second Trump administration, has raised very serious questions about whether retaining democratic forms is part of the agenda. I don't think I need to elaborate in great detail, but you can see, the attempt to rule by executive order, to quash judicial review, the incredible mobilizations of state forces that have taken place, the generation of an enemy within, particularly in the wake of the Charlie Kirk killing. You see an administration that seems more and more ready to suppress fundamental democratic rights, and a whole number of the members of the administration seem to me to be talking the language of one party rule. They are prepared to demonize even their liberal position, the Democrats, and label them part of an enemy within. So it seems to me we have an extremely dangerous authoritarian course that is being charted of great significance. And just before I put up the post, somebody had posted a quote from Trotsky, put forward, I think, in With a France in 1934, in which he says, the historic function of fascism is to smash the working class, destroy its organizations, and stifle political liberties when the capitalists find themselves unable to govern and dominate with the help of democratic machinery. And in large measure, I think the Trump administration is certainly fitting the bill with regards to that kind of approach, to a degree that's quite striking. Um, there are obviously enormous differences that exist between the models that were put in place by Mussolini and Hitler and what's unfolding in the United States. Enormous differences, and I'm uncomfortable with this effort to just say, well, it's fascism anyway, because it's 21st century fascism as opposed to 20th century fascism. I think there has to be a more precise effort to define things. But if you look at sort of, in trying to evaluate it, I look at the features that emerged in the case of the 20th century model, and I look at today, and I see both differences and similarities that are quite striking. First of all, both of them arise obviously out of conditions of crisis within the capitalist system. That's unquestionably true. Differences in terms of the crisis, but we are today unquestionably dealing with a highly unstable situation that, moreover, is centered at the moment in terms of the role of the United States within the world system. The turn to America first, the loss of hegemonic power, etc., or the eroding of hegemonic power, being a very major feature of that. Um, the, the second point that constantly emerges is that of the ruling class being unable to govern through democratic forms. Certainly not as clear cut as in the case of of Germany and Italy in the last century, but there is unquestionably a crisis within the governmental system in the United States. Um, and After the first administration of Trump, I think there was a turn to Biden and a hope in a Biden restoration and a return to a rules based order and all the rest of it. And the Biden administration proved to be a disaster. There's much less confidence in that alternative, I think, in high circles today, and a greater level of support, or at least acquiescence to what Trump is doing. When it comes to a comparison of the working class threat, there are obviously enormous differences. Germany and Italy in the last century faced the possibility of revolution, faced major upsurges. But at the same time, I think we have such a crisis within the system, that the need for extremely authoritarian rules and a rule and a loss of patience in the norms of bourgeois democracy is certainly clearly in evidence, and not just in the United States. It's an international phenomenon. Um, in terms of a mass fascist base, clearly very, very significant differences. MAGA represents certainly a very reactionary social base, but much less clearly formed. Nothing comparable to the mass fascist parties of the 20s and 30s. Nothing comparable to the brown shirts, the street armies, and the kinds of mobilizations that took place. With all due respects to the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys and such like, nothing like the kinds of possibilities that could be unleashed at that time. Obviously, um, nationalism and racism are common denominators to an enormous degree. I just happened to come across a series of posters put out by the US Department of Labor, which is a sort of a return to the Aryan male identification to an incredible degree, utterly deep racism that is part of, and profound nationalism that is part of what is going on. So overall, to try to bring together what I'm putting across here, overall, I think we have a situation where um, we are dealing with an enormous authoritarian threat. It has international implications. There are international models that are that are going down the same road, including here in Canada where I live, to a very serious degree. I think we have a real loss of patience with the norms of liberal democracy that are an international phenomenon. We have a return to authoritarianism, whether we're going to call it 20th century fascism or whether as this develops, whether we find an alternative way of expressing it. There is no question that democratic freedoms, the rights of working class organization, and such things are under very severe attack, are in very great danger, and the need to mobilize and fight and pose clear political alternatives to this phenomenon are a pressing task for the working class movement in the United States and in a whole number of countries. Thanks very much, comrades.
So that's it, John.
Mm.
You finished, yeah?
I'm done. I'm all done.
Okay. Nothing like your 15 minutes. Right. Thanks very much for that, John. Who would like to make a contribution first? Don't all rush at once. Roger.
Well, I didn't intend to come in so early, but I'd like to make a few points. I think I agree with John entirely. I think we probably do need to find a new term, a new word to describe the new phenomenon that exists. It's certainly very, very ugly and a very, very dangerous threat to the working class. But I think it's connected to, uh, first of all, it's a worldwide phenomenon. We see a turn to the so-called far right, for want of a better term, throughout the world, throughout Europe. There's most of Europe is in the hands of either far right governments or coalitions in which the far right play a part. The only major exceptions are Germany, France, and Britain, and all three of them seem to be hurtling towards the victory of far right parties themselves. And of course, it stretches to major capitalist countries outside of Europe and America. India, for instance, is one example, and of course, in the USA, in the most supreme and purest example. Now, what is behind this? I think one factor that needs to be taken into account is the new face of capitalism in the present era, in the present reactionary era. There was a time when capitalism was a vibrant and progressive force in society. Those days, of course, are long, long, long gone in the age of imperialism, of world wars, and of monopolization. And that's the key point that I want to bring into the equation, if you like. The world now has more dollar billionaires than ever. I think the last I've seen is 2,781. Of the top 10, 8 are in the USA, 1 in France, and 1 in India. They're richer than ever. The richest 20 accumulated a combined $700 billion in the single year from 2023 to 2024. The second number of billionaires after USA is China with 473, and after that, India with 200. If you look at it another way, the wealth of the 400 richest people grew in the last year by almost $1 trillion. There's been a colossal rise in inequality, while the wealth of the world's richest 1% has trebled since 1989. That of the poorest 50% have not grown at all in the same period. I could give many, many other statistics, but the point I'm making is I think it's this gross concentration of wealth that partially explains the nature of bourgeois politics today, and particularly of US politics. Because in the past, the state was a kind of executive committee of quite a wide social class. in the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels summed up the functions of the capitalist state by saying the executive of the modern state is but a committee for managing the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie. So they had to act as an arbiter between different capitalist interests. They were managing their affairs, protecting their common interests, administering their needs, formulating policies, regulating competition, resolving disputes between them, collecting taxes, providing essential services, maintaining order, and of course, above all, subduing the threat of working class revolt. And that was true at a time when the capitalist class was had quite a spread within the population, that they had rival competing interests. But you have such gross monopolization now that in a way it's a dictatorship of two or three giant corporations, and they so you get this situation. It's personified in Trump, who's running the state like he in the title of his book, The Art of the Deal. Everything is just a deal, a transaction. Fundamentally, a property speculator. He's got his eye on, of course, Canada, as John will confirm, and on Greenland and the Panama Canal and the minerals of Ukraine and the Riviera of the Middle East in Gaza and so on. And it's just everything is a straight business deal. And of course, that is also the myopia, because he's got no political skills, and it's just brute force and brute bullying. Do you call that fascism? Uh, well, obviously, as John has pointed out, it's not. It hasn't come at the end of long periods of class struggle as it did in Italy and in Germany. At that time, it was fascism. The main objective of fascism was physically to destroy the organizations of the working class, outright slaughter, strike breaking street gangs, and it was only after years, and in Germany's case, a decade and a half of revolution and counter-revolution, that finally Hitler came to power, was able to completely destroy the whole tradition and completely atomize the working class. Now, that's not the situation so far now, as John says. I mean, there are fascist organizations in reserve, but they're nothing like, they don't have anything like the street fighting gangs of the black shirts and of the SA and so on. But they are there in reserve, and they no doubt they would be called at a certain time when necessary, called into to practice. So how do we define the new phenomenon? I've suggested that we use the word plutocracy in the original sense of the word. It's rule by the rich. It's a direct rule. They dispensed with the need to have a professional administration to run their affairs. They're simply directly imposing their will without any of the finesse, or without any of the uh, uh, the skills that would be developed, the political skills and administrative skills of the past. It's simply brute bullying and force. I think that was something like this was actually predicted by Abraham Lincoln. There's a quote by Abraham Lincoln that was thought to be misattributed, but it's actually he did say this in a private correspondence. Lincoln said, "I see in the near future a crisis approaching that unnerves me and causes me to tremble for the safety of my country. Corporations have been enthroned, an era of corruption in high places will follow, and the money power of the country will endeavour to prolong its reign by working upon the prejudices of the people until the wealth is aggregated in a few hands and the republic is destroyed. Now that quote was, or that extract was quoted by Jack London in his absolutely prophetic novel, The Iron Heel. When I won't quote from that now, but the only difference is that Jack London thought that the regime of the super rich would last for 1,000 years. Of course, the world doesn't have 1,000 years in the first place. But secondly, also, we see already actually that the Trump regime and all these regimes are by no means, at least the way I look at it, I don't see these as having a long-term stability. I think it's just one uh, one kind of death throw of capitalism, where there's going to be constant crises, advances, retreats, new repressions, new uprisings, and a completely unstable future ahead. I'll leave it at that now, but I'd be very interested to know what other comrades think, and of course, John in particular.
Roger, John or Dominic?
John, the way I look at it, I think if Trump had his way, it would be a fascist state. I mean, you've only to look at the present situation where he is using the American military, as he puts it, to get rid of drug dealers that are shipping tons and tons of narcotics into the United States. The only thing is that most of them are actually off the coast of the northern coast of South America. They're not off the coast of California, Louisiana, Texas, or Florida. And again, Trump, I think, is acting in my mind as a Roman emperor who is almost claiming deity as his prerogative. But if one looks at America, and particularly the recent events in America, and the recent elections in Virginia, New Jersey, and particularly the recent election in New York, that, to my mind, shows that there is a very serious opposition to Trump, that Trump now is going after some big news organisations, the latest one being the BBC. But all the gurus that are coming on the telly and telling us about this Trump thing, that he wants $10 billion from the BBC for slandering him, for this misquote. In reality, in my opinion, it was a very accurate quote of what happened in January of last year when Trump, or whenever it was, 4 years ago, when Trump tried to, destroy the result of the American presidential election. And the program, from what I can make out, of the new mayor of New York seems not just to be radical, but seems to be, really socialist. Unfortunately, in Britain at the moment, there is no serious news organisations, so one doesn't get any serious analysis of what has happened in New York. They downplay New Jersey and Virginia as, oh, well, it was the cost of living that, gave the Democrats victories in these two states. So, as I see it, there is a growing reaction against Trump. This latest one as well, I think it's a Mary Taylor Greene in Georgia who split from Trump. Now, as I say, we get no serious analysis of the situation, because the guy who was on the BBC said that she has serious differences with Trump over Palestine, over the Ukraine, and over the cost of living. But, as I say, we get no serious analysis. But the fact that people who were really flag wavers and, sort of standard bearers for Trump are not all lining up behind him. That I think he's making serious mistakes, and because he has no political analysis, that he rules by decree, as I say, like a Roman emperor. I mean, it just doesn't, strike me that, the fascist thing is there. I mean, for instance, in the latter days of Trump's previous presidency, one was seeing a large mobilization of groups like the Proud Boys, particularly the one where they attacked the Capitol. That was in my mind, a serious situation, but nothing seems to have developed from that. We hear, if you like, ICE, which is the anti-immigration arm of the American establishment, moving into action, but that is a state setup that seems to be fairly unpopular. That there is real reaction against this ICE, and as I say, for my mind, fascism would develop from the sort of thing that we had in England last year, and that was the riots that occurred after the murders in Southport. But far from being a reaction that, if you like, mobilised popular support, it actually mobilised popular loathing, because people regarded the people on the riots attacking the police as being nothing but a set of thugs and not representing, if you like, the values that most people in Britain would like to think that they hold. I'm not trying to portray Britain as a beacon of, if you like, liberalism or liberal thought, because at the moment, the present government has, gone on some absolutely stupid reactionary directions. For instance, the labelling as terrorist a group of people who sprayed paint on a military plane after breaking into an army or an air force base, that people are now almost queuing up to be prosecuted because people who support Palestine, realise that it'll just clog up the whole legal system, which already is in absolute chaos. But Keir Starmer thinks by bringing in, if you like, draconian legislation, he can solve that problem. And as I say, I look at other, if you like, straws in the wind. The fact that in the recent elections in Holland, that the right winger, I forget his name now, who's been around for a long time, their equivalent of Nigel Farage, who looked as though he was going to win the election, it actually turned out to be a draw between him and a pro-immigrant candidate. So, as I say, I just feel myself that there is a growing resentment against Trump and some serious straws in the wind. The fact that in Canada, Trump seems to have mobilized the whole population in terms of their anti-American sentiments, particularly at sports matches, particularly when they're playing American teams and the American national anthem is played. There isn't any cowering of, oh, Trump can do this and Trump can do that. I'll leave it at that, comrades.
John, Finn. Finn, did you hear me?
Oh, yeah,
You're
sorry.
next.
Sorry, Pam.
Yeah.
Comrades, I think this is an extremely important topic, particularly at this juncture in history. And I want to thank John for his opening contribution. But the first point I want to make, now I know that inevitably Trump and America dominate the discussion because that's the topic. But I want to start by saying the situation in America can change any time in our favor. 5 million people turned out to march in US cities, 2,000 cities, I believe. But the trade union structures are there that workers can use openly and defiantly, to fight against the measures of the government. Now, when the Trump administration sacked hundreds of thousands of workers, this is before the lockdown, some of the excuses that Trump made were, they were Democrats, or they're leaning towards Democrats. But that can change. And the existing structures in America, in terms of the elections to the House of Representatives, to the Senate, to local governments, for governorships, they can all be won by progressive forces, by workers' organizations, and if you like, by the left. That can be done. That structure and that organizational system is there to be used. The biggest mistake that can now be made is for people to reopen the delusions or the illusions they had in the Democrats. Now, Mamdani has spoken out clearly on a number of issues, but the main lesson that the Democratic centre structure wants is to win the next presidency and to examine ways in which they can modify their programme in order to win that presidency. It would be a disaster if the workers were deluded into moving down into that pathway once again. But the point I'm making is that the existing structures in America can be used today. The trade unions, the political structures, the elections right across the state, individual states, the federal elections can be used by workers to achieve significant victories. Now, that would not be possible under fascism. So the reason I'm saying, bringing my contribution with that point, is that we don't need to feel defeated because the structures have not been used. There has been no mobilization of workers against the attacks on public service workers. When Trump said he would sack people for being linked in or owing their jobs, as he would describe it, to Democrats, there should have been a general strike against that threat to workers. There wasn't. Now, in most countries where the unions have a base, the reaction, well, first of all, that wouldn't have been said, but if it was, the reaction would be to mobilise to defeat that very suggestion. So we must focus on how to defeat the present system in America and not to get too bogged down in trying to define what fascism is at this stage. When fascism is upon us, we'll know. We won't need to define it. We'll know exactly when it arrives. It's not that significant. I know Trump's personality and his approach and his attacks on people is obnoxious and alienating for people. But whether or not he's a fascist individually is not the main point. The main point is fascism as a system in existence or about to come into existence in America. And there's other countries also where fascism is a threat. Even in Israel, for example, there are openly fascist kind of organizations functioning in the way we understand fascism in the most general sense. In India, a fascist organization was at the base of the foundation of Modi's party. So, plus the fascist organizations in Europe, in Germany, in Holland, that John just referred to, in France, and a number of countries. So fascism is a threat in many, many countries. But where we can defeat them, where we can defeat the right, we should do that. Instead of waiting for fascism to arrive, we should use the existing structures now to break the right wing. I thought the expression the Mamdani used to describe Trump was interesting. He called him a despot. Now, that's not a term that's often used. No, it's seen as a kind of old-fashioned term, maybe linked to classical Greek studies. But that's exactly what Trump is, a despot. And that's a good word to describe what he's at. And the word authoritarianism and authoritarian, we should cling to that word. That describes what he is trying to achieve. Now, there are aspects of what he's doing which do have echoes of fascism. There's no question. As John referred to the sending military troops into the cities to contain what he describes as crime, but it's really to just make sure the population are intimidated and are driven back into their own kind of boxes and home areas and so on. But by sending the army into cities, that's a fascist threat. No, it's not fascism, but it shows the possibilities. The attacks on the boats, for example, which Trump says coming from Venezuela, these are boats laden with drugs, destined for America, destined to kill American citizens. So as an act of war, as he described it, it's an act of war. I'm defending America by blowing up these boats. So he ignores all legal processes all that is considered as normal in the due process and so on in terms of the law. He ignores all that and takes action himself, and then appeals to a kind of popular mood against drug importation, and it kind of helps him to survive. But that is an aspect of fascism, that kind of sending troops into the cities and taking action against the boats. Now, the word terrorism is significant. Trump uses the word terrorism quite a lot because it gives him cover in legal terms. He calls these people narco-terrorists, and the terrorism, he says, that the threat that they exert is the same as the threat of any other terrorist. But now he has said to be anti-American, this is a term I came across in a recent article. He says that to be anti-American is to be terrorist. What's anti-American? You see, I mean, these are aspects of fascism which kind of come to the surface and appear, and they're dangerous threats. But as I said at the beginning, they can all be defeated, and it's important that they are defeated. But now there's another thing which is a threat, and that's the weakening of the trade unions. That's happening. Now, it's a consequence of what Trump is doing because people are afraid they lose their jobs. And you can see the logic of that. By opposing Trump, like it's not just the BBC, but ordinary workers can lose their jobs by not going along with that ethos which he tried to introduce some time back. Musk, first of all, wanted people to swear their loyalty to Trump, to his regime, and to his ideas in order to keep their jobs. Now, Musk is gone, but that idea still remains, that unless you're loyal to Trump, you lose your job. And that would explain why there's some quietude and some reluctance on the part of workers to take action. But they have to take action. And I've been interested to hear the currents to America explaining the possibilities, or outlining what are the possibilities of working class action. Now, in addition to the marches through the cities, which are very significant, but working class action on the workplace to defeat the threats of people losing their jobs by the arbitrary decisions of this regime. We need to examine that. And there are fascist organizations, as was outlined, like the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers. They are openly fascist organizations. But there's openly fascist organizations in Spain. There's openly fascist organizations in Germany. There's openly fascist organizations in many countries, but they don't have any real influence. Now, another thing which causes confusion in people's minds, certainly here in Ireland, where we have quite a big protest kind of organization against the anti-immigrant parties, but the people confuse racism with fascism. They think because a party is racist, an organization is racist, inevitably then is fascist. And they use the slogans on the streets, no fascists here, no Nazis and all that. So the way this thing plays out then on the street is that when working class communities, and this is where the damage begins, reject the unemployment, the deprivation, the poverty, the alienation that exists across the society, when workers experience that, they're then influenced by right-wing ideas that say, well, the problem is, of course, the immigration. It's the immigrants. If it wasn't for the immigrants, you would have a job and a place to live. Now, that argument has to be answered. That's an argument which is false, it's delusionary, and it needs to be taken up and answered. It's no solution to be marching around shouting Nazis out, no fascists on our streets, no Nazis, and that's what's happening. When the real argument is about housing, about wages, about living standards. So we need to answer these arguments, go into the communities and take on these arguments. Instead of shouting and roaring about fascists and Nazis, what happens in that regard is that the people in the area who are alienated and against the government and against all the measures about cost of living and housing and so on that affect people so badly, when they're described as Nazis, then we know this because we've had discussions with people involved in this dilemma. The people in the area, the right-wing leaders who are, some of them would like fascism, they say, you see, we're an ordinary working class community, and these bastards are calling us Nazis. We're not Nazis, we're just ordinary men and women who live in working class communities that are deprived. So the right wing can use that kind of abusive language to strengthen their own support. So we need, as I said earlier, to answer the arguments that these people pose. And there's also a delusion that violence defines fascism. It doesn't. There's violent attacks here on race, on black people, Indian people, and other immigrants. Violent attacks from time to time. Buildings that have been designated as centres in accommodation for what are called international protection applicants have been attacked. I think 30 buildings have been burnt in Ireland, buildings that had been designated as hostels and refuges for asylum seekers. Now, that's happening, but that is not fascism. So people say, see, they're burning down, the fascists are burning down the buildings. That's not what's going on. We have to go back to the argument. The argument is about poverty, alienation, the lack of housing. There's a big immigration now from Ireland, and we need to answer these arguments instead of yelling abuse and all that about to the people who were influenced by right-wing ideas. Now, in the recent election for presidency in Ireland, there was a presidential election, which is a bit of a mock election in a way because the president has no power. But nonetheless, it was significant as an indicator of the thinking. The extreme right, the racists, the anti-immigrants, let alone the fascists, made no impact. No impact at all. The division was between the government parties, which are conservative right-wing parties, like the Tory party in Britain. The division was between them and a united left. There were a few attempts by right-wing leaders, including people with fascist bent. They made a few attempts to stand in the election. There's, for instance, Conor McGregor, who's an open racist, anti-immigrant demagogue with ignorant, stupid person that he is. And incidentally, as a passing comment, the what's called mixed martial arts, actually, that's not martial arts at all. Martial arts is a disciplined, controlled event. Martial arts is just beating somebody till hopping their head off the ground till they have to give up or die. Anyway, the right wing mobilise amongst the mixed martial arts communities at their events and so on. They turn out to try and mobilise them. Anyway, McGregor tried to stand, and other right wing candidates tried to stand. But one of the things you have to do in Ireland to get a nomination for the presidency is you need to be nominated by a local authority or by elected parliamentary representatives. There's a certain number, but that's the direction you have to go. And these right-wing people got no echo at all in these communities. They couldn't get themselves even onto the ballot paper. They couldn't even get themselves nominated to stand for presidency, let alone win or make an impact. And the left had a huge 2-1 victory in that election. And we need to get confidence from that. Now, the right wing are saying, oh, it's a very undemocratic system. They wouldn't let us stand. The reason they can't stand it is because they can't get a base in the local authorities. Now, whether that's good or bad, we can argue about that, but the local authorities didn't back them, and neither did the elected representatives back them. So the right wing doesn't have a base. So I conclude on the point I began with. We have the opportunity to achieve victories now by organising workers, by organising for elections, by organising for the trade union actions that are required, by mobilising on the streets. We can do all of that. Nothing can stop us doing any of that. Now, if there was fascism, we'd know all about it. Because you couldn't do that. There wouldn't be independent trade unions. There wouldn't be elections. There wouldn't be political parties. So when fascism comes, we'll know it's here. It's not here now. And we have the opportunity now to make all the gains that we think are necessary to protect the livelihood and the well-being of working class communities and working class organisations. So thanks again, John, for opening the contribution. There's lots of issues we have to discuss here and trash out. We won't find answers to all the questions. We're not here to find final answers. We're here to explore experiences and to find out what's the best way to advance the case for socialism across a range of countries.
Okay, thanks, Finn. Roy.
Yeah. The implications of a Trump administration is of concern to people in continents outside of America, as well as the ongoing battles within America and so on. Trump came in on a MAGA ticket, and at his inauguration, he lined up behind him almost all the tech giants, some of the biggest and the richest fellows on the planet. One of them was bold enough to even put up the Nazi salute. That is the kind of scenario that we looked at, and we look at an administration which has been imposing tariffs of all kinds all over, some large, some small, in in every shape and form. But I think the concern I have, and I think concern the world has, is the military-industrial complex in America. That is now being given a boost by the deals that is made with NATO countries to purchase weapons for ongoing wars. The Ukraine war continues, aided and abetted by Trump, or the Trump administration, started, of course, by the Biden administration. I'm reminded of Angela Davis in the 70s saying that the difference between the Democrats and the Republicans was the difference between Tweedledum and Tweedledee. So we've got that kind of scenario which has been, that the world has had to deal with. We've had a concern now that the world is closer to war, to doomsday, if not general wars in many countries. We've been closer than we've ever been. We've had a situation where with Palestine and the machinations that have been going on in Palestine and Israel, we've had Netanyahu being supported. We've had the Americans wanting to set up a base on the border of Gaza, a military base. And those are the kinds of scenarios. We've got the threats of war against Venezuela, Cuba, and just about any other country. We've had his intention, stated intention, that he would like to occupy or to take over countries like Greenland. I think Canada was also under threat at some point, Mexico. All of these are elements of a kind of scenario which is telling us that it's not just what's happening in America, it has deep implications for us outside of America. We've got, in Africa, he's got this racist attitude to Africa. He would insult Africa at every turn. We know that this administration, and I'm including the Secretary of State as well, who is an avowed Zionist, people like that who are determined to cause wars in many countries and to continue wars. We've had Sudan and so on. So this is the scenario that we are in. So quite apart, irrespective of how we may define America and how we may define Trump, there is a global threat which does emanate to a large extent from America. The European countries tend to kowtow to America. So do many of the other countries as well, the Middle Eastern countries. So we have a scenario which is much bigger than what Trump has started. And I think that is the concern that we have. We don't want to forget as well that analysts tell us that there are at least 750 American military bases in the world. The one in Gaza or outside of Gaza for the control of Gaza, occupation of the land in Gaza and possibly other parts would be 751. We've got the Syria, where a fellow has the notoriety of beheading and chopping of hands in the Syrian wars, was welcomed into the White House. So we've got various elements. We may say it's not fascism. Yes, it may not be that in the classical sense or in the sense of the 40s or the 30s and the 40s, but we certainly have very many worrying elements. Thank you.
Thanks, Roy. Joe, do you want to go next? Joe Duffy, are you there? Yes, he is. Don't forget to unmute yourself. Yeah, we can't hear you at the moment. You're muted. Joe, you're muted. We can't hear you.
Sorry, I thought I hit unmute, but I didn't hit it properly. Sorry about that. Yeah, no, just want to say, make one brief point in relation to what Finn said there, and on the far right in Ireland and the election. By the way, I think Finn made a fantastic contribution. Every other point I absolutely agreed with, and particularly would salute the points he made in relation to people going along and shouting fascists at ordinary working class people in working class areas because they happen to feel very, very angry and about their situation and are mistakenly in frustration joining these riots and so on. Like we can't forgive them, but we can understand what's happening. But if the left is shown to show no understanding, then it does drive ordinary people into the hands of the right. And I think Finn's explanation of that was spot on. Where I would disagree with Finn is, and I would disagree very strongly, Finn, is that I think that your explanation of what happened in the election is a little bit blinkered. The reason the far right weren't actually a factor in the election, that's on the nominally they weren't a factor in that they couldn't get a candidate endorsed by the local authorities, as you said. No parliamentary representative from the Conservative parties was going to back them. Nobody from the left was going to back them. So that channel was ruled out to them. They do not have parliamentary representation at this stage. But just because you don't have parliamentary representation doesn't mean that you haven't got some sort of a base in these areas in terms of your ideas. We would have held that position in relation to left-wing ideas, that just because we didn't have parliamentary representation before People Before Profit and so on, but there still was a left-wing currents in working class areas at the time. And in relation to the local authorities are made up of councillors. The councillors are again predominantly from the Conservative parties or from parties which were standing behind the candidate who won the election. So I hope everybody can understand this without me going into too much detail in relation to Ireland, because there are people from outside Ireland here. But you could not get endorsed by the local authority because the Conservative parties dominate. And I say Conservative, the Sinn Féin would be in there as well. They would have not endorsed any right-wing candidates. So the fact that the mixed martial arts candidate, well, he wasn't officially standing for them, but he's famous for being a representative of that sport. All these candidates, they could not stand. But where the proof of what I'm saying is that the spoiled vote was 13% overall, and every single poll and every piece of analysis that was done showed that 2/3 of that vote, at the very, very least, would have represented far right objections. It would have been not overtly fascist, but it would have been racist, would have been like blaming immigration as the main problem in Ireland and so on. There's also a candidate who didn't get to stand, who wasn't endorsed, but who nearly got endorsed. She got some support amongst a number of councils, a number of people. Her name was Maria Steen. She was in separate polls, which were conducted before the election, which had her name on the ballot paper, as well as the presidential candidate who won and the Conservative candidate, showed that she would have got up to 22% of support. One had her at 18%, one at 22%. So to say that the far right were not represented in the election, that's nominally, on the surface it's true, but when you go a little bit deeper, it would be very much wishful thinking to say that they have not got a base in Ireland. They do not have a base for fascist ideas and fascist ideology thrashed out and worked out. And I would absolutely agree with Finn on that. And the same in the United States. But that anger and that frustration that's in those communities is finding expression through supporting candidates who are very much anti-immigration. They are seeing immigration as the problem, not the capitalist system, and that's the key. And as long as they're in that area of as long as they're in that zone of political thinking, they are a danger in that they could end up supporting very, very right-wing, super populist candidates who then go on to form fascist parties. And there's been some encouragement for even from the establishment in Ireland to people like Maria Steen, who could have got 20%, 20% in that election if she had stood. There's moves afoot to try and get her to maybe link up with a couple of other significant figures to form a fascist party. And I think that would be a more accurate description of what actually happened in relation to the presidential election. I'll leave it at that. Can I also just say that I thought Dominic's description of Trump as being more like a Roman emperor who fancies himself a deity, I thought that was absolutely spot on. So well played, Dominic. All right, cheers. Thank you. Okay, bye-bye.
Thanks, Joe. Right, there's no hands up at the moment. Does anybody want to come in again to answer any of that? Or John, John Clark, do you want to come back in now?
Yes, certainly I can respond to some of the points that were made. It was a very wide-ranging discussion, and I won't even pretend that I'm going to cover everything that was said, but there are perhaps three points I'd like to amplify a little bit. The first, I'd like to deal with Roger's concept of a plutocracy, and Jack London's iron heel was raised in a very appropriate way, I think, there. Yeah, I think there's a great deal of truth to the fact that there has been an incredible concentration of power. And if you look at the backers of the Trump administration, you do see prominent billionaires playing this role. The notion of that concentration of power and wealth that has taken place being an inducement for a move in authoritarian directions, I think is fundamentally and completely correct. I would say, though, that I don't know that I don't know that the ruling class is solidly behind Trump by any manner of means, even in its most powerful quarters. There are divisions, and they appeared when Trump organized the provocation at the Capitol at the end of his first administration, where you had the main employers' organizations reiterating their commitment to democratic forms and being highly critical of Trump and such like. And for a period, as one comrade in the United States put it, the Democrats were the A team. As far as the ruling class was concerned, Biden was put forward as the solution. It was sometimes referred to as the Biden restoration. And the whole idea was that the responsible stewardship of a capitalist economy within a bourgeois democratic framework and a return to the rule of international law, selectively employed by the United States all along, of course, was going to be re-established. But Biden floundered disastrously. I mean, he floundered on the international stage terribly. Domestically, he eroded his base of support. He allowed the incredible phenomenon of Trump coming back for a second time to take place. And it's really striking that there is much less support, or there's much less in terms of a confident alternative within the US ruling class and the US establishment generally. I think that's the situation. Now, certainly Trump's sheer unpopularity may create electoral opportunities for the Democrats, but fundamentally, I think the political center is not offering a viable alternative. That's not to say that Trump's alternative is viable, but the move towards authoritarian directions and the extreme impatience with democratic forms is something that I think is clearly taking place at the highest level in the United States, and not just in the United States. It's clearly as well an international phenomenon. This is a very dangerous development. I mean, the notion of fascism is something that the ruling class turns to when it's exhausted its confidence in bourgeois democracy, is something that is a factor that's at play here at the moment. I think that's absolutely true. Second, it was pointed out that Trump, if he had his way, would be implementing fascism. And I think Trump has thoroughly fascistic instincts. There's some truth to that, and he's certainly surrounded by an array of people. Think of Stephen Miller, for example, an odious little swine, if ever there was one. He clearly embraces those kinds of extreme authoritarian sentiments as well. It's true, of course, that fascism has not been created in the United States. Finn makes the point, and it's absolutely correct, of course, that there is still very much the legal rights and the reality of working class organization in the United States that is very far from extinguished. It's still extremely strong. However, the existence of those rights and of those organizations, I don't think is grounds for overconfidence. I mean, even Hitler and Mussolini took some time to consolidate their rule. It took Hitler several months before he was ready to move on outlawing trade unions, and Mussolini took an extended period of time before he actually created one-party rule. I do feel that the reality is that that what we have is a governing power in the United States that is moving in the direction of embracing one of the clear functions of fascism, which is to smash working class organization, atomize the working class capacity for resistance. And Trump is, I believe, moving clearly in those directions. That doesn't mean that you can just, put the swastika up and say that it's that the new fascism has arrived. But that fundamental objective of preventing any form of working class organization and resistance is something that is being moved towards very, very enthusiastically and very, very clearly, I think. So the authoritarian danger is enormous. Finally, though I didn't really deal with the question, I was more trying to deal with the definition of the regime. The point that was made about the continued capacity for working class resistance is, of course, absolutely correct and absolutely precious. You did have, in fact, 7 million people taking to the streets in the No Kings protests, and however inadequate the program of that mobilization was, a mobilization of 7 million people is nothing to sneeze at. You've got as well enormous possibilities for major resistance. And one of the things that takes place in this present period in the United States is absolutely a case in point, is resistance can explode with incredible rapidity. Like during the the first Trump administration, the Black Lives Matter mobilization was at that time the largest mobilization that had taken place. You had an incredible movement that backfooted Trump at that time to a huge degree. So I'm not. The last thing I want to do is write off the possibilities for working class resistance in the United States. It's incredibly powerful and has enormous possibilities. The political limitations of the forces that are leading it are severe, but the possibilities are incredible. I was watching a lot of the mobilization that's taken place against the immigration raids, and what you have now is an incredible level of enormous and intense community-based organization in working class communities, where people can turn out large numbers of people to challenge an ICE raid virtually instantaneously. Now that speaks to that. That's not like taking weeks to build for a demonstration. That's a level of intense organization and collectivity within a working class community that's incredibly precious. So Trump is fragile. He is erratic. There are enormous dangers and there are divisions emerging within the Trumpian right. That's absolutely unquestionable. In no way do I want to overstate their strength, but I do feel it's necessary to embrace the dangers. And if I return to the quote I gave from Trotsky, I think the objective of denying the working class the opportunity to organize and resist, which can only be achieved through a mass imposing catastrophic defeats, is a real danger that is facing us, and a real danger that we have to react to. And finally, I would just say that the international implications of what Trump is of Trump's changes of direction are enormous as well, perhaps particularly in the Western Hemisphere, because as we see with the attack emerging on Venezuela, you have a situation where the US, facing a great deal of rivalry from China, actually within Latin America, the United States is looking to reconsolidate its iron grip, and just I forget which member of the administration it was, but I was just reading him use the term "our hemisphere." You know, a return to the concepts of manifest destiny to an incredible degree. Internationally, across the globe, I think the implications of the America First turn is that the US under Trump has relinquished the idea of the US as being the steward of a rules-based international order. And I'm not trying to in any way romanticize that world-based order. It was an organized form of exploitation and violence at all times. But the notion of the United States taking responsibility for maintaining some level of global stability has really gone out of the window. Trump is concerned with, somebody pointed out, he's a transactional figure. He's looking to make individual deals and run a kind of a global extortion racket using US economic power and military power on the world stage in ways that are profoundly destabilizing and profoundly damaging. So, yes, an enormously dangerous administration domestically and internationally, but by no means is it undefeatable or invincible. It can be defeated, and it must be defeated, and I'll go out on a limb and say it will be defeated.
Okay, thanks, John. We can't see any other hands up. I don't know whether that means perhaps we're sorts out for now. Anybody else? Roger.
Well, I don't want to add much, but I do think the point is that the aid of the kind of liberal, benevolent patronage of the kind of conservative establishment, that has gone. That was a product of the boom years, and then of the fear of the ruling class of taking on the working class. It took a long time to erode the power of the working class through the destruction of working class communities, industrial communities, and so on. But we now have a situation where the old centre parties, so-called, or the old benevolent liberal capitalist parties, which were by and large the norm in the major capitalist countries, that era has gone completely. There's okay, yes, maybe there's a few countries where politicians who originally were based in from those stables maybe are still there, but really the major parties of the ruling class have are really being shoved aside, or they're being shoved aside very rapidly. There's the rise of extreme far-right parties in the model of Trump, which are increasingly the norm. But that shows the erosion of the base of the capitalist class socially. With the concentration of wealth, yeah, they become much more consolidated in one sense. But socially and politically, there's actually the working class has grown enormously. There's one figure that I keep quoting, but I think it's very significant that in Britain, of course, it was the objective of Thatcher to destroy the industrial base in Britain, and she succeeded. The industrial working class, which was a major percentage of the population, and was which resisted all attempts to cow it in the period of the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and the beginning of the 80s. Thatcher came in and actually dismantled industry. It was not only a political attack; it was also the ossification, the kind of hardening of the arteries of the industry of industry, which was getting more and more obsolescent. But nevertheless, the industrial working class was destroyed. The miners, the car factories, the shipyards, the steelworks, etc. They've all gone. At that time, in 1983, there was a social. So before Thatcher had completed that objective, there was a social survey, and 60% of the population classified themselves as being working class. The same survey, a similar survey, was done just recently, and despite the complete destruction of the industrial base of the British economy and of the British population, still the same figure, 60% classified themselves as working class. And that's because there's been a proletarianization of elements that previously would have considered themselves at least neutral or even part of the establishment, if you like. You now have major strikes of doctors, of lawyers, of university lecturers, of I don't need to continue, the spelling out the list, but because they've been forced by the immiseration of their conditions, their living conditions, and their status in society. As a result, they've been forced into industrial action, and they have become proletarianized. And meanwhile, the social base of, in the general strike in 1926 in Britain, it was those kind of elements that were queuing up to be strikebreakers, and the students and the youth in particular, students and middle class youth and so on. Now, you could not envisage that elements like that would be able to be mobilized and drafted in to keep the wheels of the economy going. In other words, then, there's been an erosion of the social base and the political base of the ruling class. It's had to rely on more and more on bigotry and racism and sort of aping fascism. They don't. I agree with all the comrades. It's not a fascist. They don't represent fascism. They try to deploy as a auxiliary force fascist forces. And we did see recently a very frightening phenomenon in Britain of at least 100,000 people, or maybe 200,000 people mobilized and marching under the banner of Tommy Robinson, so-called, who is a fascist. And by the way, both the fascists here and the AfD in Germany and all these other forces, as well as the Proud Boys, etc., in USA, are all the recipients of donations and patronage and support by the biggest plutocrat of the lot, Elon Musk, who has just been granted by his company $1 trillion. He's been promised on the basis of the New Deal. He is actually the world's first trillionaire. That's $1 million. And that, I think, that sums up the whole situation. That that there is a shrinking percentage of the population, actually now just a handful of figures, who are behind Trumpism and reaction and the plutocracy or the oligarchy or whatever you want to call them. And there is a vast working class, but politically, we've seen the political progression of the ruling class from liberal democracy towards racism and this kind of extremely savage, brutal policy that are personified by Trump. But we don't yet see a corresponding political mobilization of the working class. And that's the thing. I mean, we're seeing signs of it. We're seeing maybe the beginning of a mass left party in Britain, although that's still to be decided whether that's actually going to materialize. That's another question, which of course we'll be discussing on another occasion. But we do see things like comrades have pointed out, things like the Mamdani victory in New York. We see Finn said 5 million. The figure I saw was 7 million people actually participated in the demonstrations simultaneously throughout the USA just a month or so ago. I mean, I think things are moving towards a very sharp and rapid polarization in society. I think we could imagine, for instance, Trump. I don't think we could put it past him that he would try to avoid the midterm elections, or maybe a new presidential election in 4 years' time. There may be. I mean, I think we could see such a sharp polarization. We see, there's millions of people who are straining at the least, if you like, to actually get into action and to express themselves on the streets and in mobilization. And in Britain and in USA, with the traditions there and with the proliferation of guns and the whole tradition of the private armies and all the rest of it. I can't remember what they call them in the different states. But I think we could be moving towards a kind of situation of civil war in the USA in 3 or 4 years' time. Maybe not, but I do think the polarization is happening, and whether there's a return towards the Democrats, I don't know, but I do think surely there's got to come a split in the Democrats sooner or later, and the development of a left force within U.S. society. And I think similarly, a similar polarization we're going to see, and we're beginning to see worldwide.
Okay, thanks, Roger. Well, again, there's just no hands up. No. John, do you want to make some closing comments? Because I think we're at the end of the discussion now.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I said before probably stands as a closing comment, but I just think in terms of all of the discussion, we're all of us grappling with what is a new and changing phenomenon. We're seeing a situation of incredible volatility and instability within global capitalism. We're seeing major changes in terms of the political systems and the forms of representation that take place, and we're seeing a move towards authoritarianism that has a great deal in common with the fascist movements of the 1920s and the 1930s and 40s, but that has as well very substantial differences. I just emphasized the basic point that I wanted to get across, that the objective of not just simply containing the capacity for working class organization, but of actually crushing it, is something that is on the agenda at this point. It is something that Trump and his closest advisors think about in terms of, and I mean, Roger mentioned the possibility of sort of like cancelling elections. I mean, that's pretty incredible that we sit here, we talk about the possibility of elections being cancelled in the United States, but it's no fanciful proposition. Several of the leading members of the administration, Miller and such like, have talked the language of one party rule. They work to generate an enemy within. They work to generate a sense of a state of emergency, and they include the Democrats as their enemy. You know, they've held up Antifa, this nebulous concept of Antifa as an organized, dangerous threat, and they allege that the Democratic Party is there to facilitate this danger. So the threat of the permanence of bourgeois democracy is not on the table. The possibility of forms of rule within those countries that have been run through democratic structures going over to far more authoritarian, despotic kind of forms of rule are there. That can only be achieved through imposing massive defeats on the working class, of course. And those defeats haven't happened yet. And there are major fights to be taken up. But we are living at a time of incredible dangers. And by definition, that means a time of incredible opportunities. So I think that's the essential message that I want to get across. That we shouldn't take any kind of blasé attitude to the threat that is posed by Trump and the international implications of that threat. They're very, very real and very, very pressing. Thanks, comrades.
Thanks, John. So I think that's the end of the discussion. Big thanks to John for doing such an excellent lead off, and to all the really good contributions made by comrades too. So at this point, we then move across to Roger about next week's meeting.
Right, well, as it happens, we've got a comrade from New York coming next week who will be able to tell us give us an on-the-spot report, if you like, on the situation with the election of Mamdani and what that means. So I hope all the comrades will come. I think that report will follow on very neatly from the discussion we've had today.
Okay, thanks, Roger. So that's it for today. We'll see you next week at the same time. Bye.